20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10.
On July 20th, 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the moon. His words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became immortal. But while history was being made, Armstrong wasn't just an astronaut or an American hero. He was also a husband and a father. Behind the visor and the headlines were children growing up in the shadow of their father's incredible achievement. Children who had to find their own path, while the world saw them only as Neil Armstrong's kids. This is the story of Eric, Mark, and Karen Armstrong, and whatever happened to the family of the first man on the moon. Neil Armstrong's path to the moon began long before Apollo 11. Born in 1930 in the small town of Wapakoneta, Ohio, he was fascinated by flight from the start. At just 16 years old, before he even had a driver's license, he earned his pilot's license. Friends from his youth recalled how he would spend hours building model airplanes and staring at the sky. One classmate once said, "Neil wasn't loud or flashy. He was the quiet one who was always focused, always steady." He went on to study aeronautical engineering at Purdue University, part of the Holloway Plan, where his studies were interrupted by military service. During the Korean War, Armstrong flew 78 combat missions as a Navy pilot. Fellow aviators remembered his calm under fire. One Navy colleague remarked, "Even when things were going wrong in the cockpit, Neil never lost his cool. He had ice in his veins." After the war, he returned to Purdue and then pursued a career as a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. There, he flew some of the most experimental aircraft ever designed, including the X-15 rocket plane, which could skim the edge of space at nearly 4,000 miles per hour. Other pilots admired his precision. Fellow test pilot Bill Dana once said, "Neil was the engineer's engineer. He didn't fly for glory. He flew to understand." In 1962, NASA selected Armstrong as part of its second group of astronauts. His colleagues quickly noticed his quiet determination. Astronaut Gene Cernan, who later became the last man to walk on the moon, described him as a man who, when the spotlight was brightest, simply did his job with no need for attention. 7 years later, in July 1969, Armstrong would step onto the lunar surface as commander of Apollo 11. The world heard his words. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." But those who knew him heard the same calm, measured tone they'd always known. And if you are into classic Hollywood icons, amazing stories, and newly discovered insights, then hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers, and your support will mean a lot to our channel. The honors that followed were immense. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Space Medal of Honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, and countless international awards. But Armstrong never embraced the role of celebrity. He turned down endorsement deals and television opportunities. Instead, he returned to teaching engineering at the University of Cincinnati. A fellow professor there remembered, he could have cashed in on his fame 100 times over, but that wasn't Neil. He wanted to be in the classroom, sharing what he knew. For all his achievements, Armstrong remained a deeply private man, someone who rarely spoke about himself and often deflected praise. His biographer James Hansen once said, "If you really want to understand Neil Armstrong, you have to look at how much he valued his family and his privacy." That's where he was most himself. And while the world revered him as the first man on the moon, at home he was simply a husband and a father, roles that meant more to him than the spotlight ever could. Neil Armstrong's family story began in the mid-1950s, when he met Janet Elizabeth Shearon at Purdue University. Neil had returned from the Korean War to finish his aeronautical engineering degree, while Janet was studying home economics. Friends recalled their courtship as simple but genuine. A fellow student once said, "Neil was the quietest guy in the room, and Janet had this spark." Together, they balanced each other perfectly. On January 28, 1956, Neil and Janet were married in Wilmette, Illinois. The ceremony was modest, attended by family and a few close friends. Janet later reflected, "We weren't thinking about the risks or the future. We were young and we believed in each other." For her, marrying Neil meant stepping into the unpredictable world of test pilots and aviation pioneers. The couple's first years together were spent near Edwards Air Force Base in California, where Neil flew experimental aircraft as a test pilot. Life there was challenging: long hours, dangerous missions, and constant uncertainty. Yet neighbors remembered the Armstrong home as welcoming. One fellow test pilot's wife recalled, "Janet made sure the house was a place of peace. Even when Neil was off pushing the edge of the sky, she kept the family grounded." In 1957, their first child, Eric, was born. Janet once joked in an interview, "Neil could land a jet on a carrier deck, but holding a baby was another challenge entirely." Still, he learned fast. Neil himself, usually reserved, admitted to a colleague, "Becoming a father was the greatest mission of my life." 2 years later, their daughter Karen arrived, nicknamed Muffy by the family. She was lively and curious, but in 1961, tragedy struck. Karen was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. The Armstrongs pursued every possible treatment, but she passed away in January 1962 at just 2 years old. Those close to Neil said the loss forever changed him. A NASA friend later reflected, "Neil rarely spoke about it, but you could see the grief behind his eyes. It made him even more private, even more determined." Later that same year, their third child, Mark, was born. Janet described his arrival as a gift that brought light back into our home. For Neil, Mark's birth was a turning point. "Life doesn't stop after tragedy," he reportedly told a colleague. "You keep going for the ones who are still here." Despite Neil's demanding schedule, test flights, astronaut training, and eventually the Apollo missions, Janet carried much of the responsibility at home. She acknowledged the strain, but also her pride. "You had to live with risk every day, but you trusted Neil. And when he walked back through that door, that was enough." Their marriage was often described as a partnership built on quiet resilience. Unlike the Hollywood love stories of the time, Neil and Janet's romance was rooted in sacrifice, patience, and mutual respect. As one neighbor put it, they didn't need to say much to each other. The way they looked at one another said it all. And so, while the world came to know Neil Armstrong as the first man on the moon, his personal story was also that of a husband and father, roles that shaped him as deeply as any flight or mission ever did. Eric "Rick" Armstrong, the eldest son of Neil and Janet, was born in 1957. From the beginning, his life was intertwined with his father's demanding career. As a toddler, he lived near Edwards Air Force Base in California, surrounded by the sound of jet engines and the culture of experimental flight. Friends of the family recalled how Eric grew up in a household that was both ordinary and extraordinary. One neighbor once said, "On the surface, they were just another young family, bikes in the driveway, kids playing outside. But you always knew Neil was doing something few others could even imagine." When Neil became an astronaut in 1962, Eric was old enough to understand that his father's job was different. He was just 12 years old when the world watched his dad step onto the lunar surface. In interviews years later, Eric admitted, "To us, he wasn't a hero. He was just Dad. We didn't see him the way the rest of the world did." Growing up, Eric shared his father's fascination with aviation and engineering. Family friends remembered him as curious, bright, and mechanically minded. Janet once remarked, "Eric could take apart a toy and put it back together before most kids figured out how it worked." As an adult, Eric pursued a career that reflected both his technical background and his independent spirit. While he never sought the spotlight, he worked in fields connected to engineering and business. He also supported projects that honored his father's legacy appearing occasionally at space-related events. A NASA colleague once said, "Eric carried himself with the same quiet confidence as his father." He never tried to be Neil, and that's exactly what made him his own man. In private life, Eric has been described as devoted to family and protective of his privacy. Much like his father, he avoided the celebrity attention that surrounded Apollo 11. Yet, when anniversaries and commemorations arose, he often stood alongside his brother Mark to represent the Armstrong family. At the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11, Eric told reporters, "What matters most isn't the fame. It's the reminder of what people can accomplish when they work together." Hobbies and personal pursuits also shaped his identity. He was drawn to aviation and technology, but also enjoyed outdoor activities and time away from the public eye. Friends described him as steady, approachable, and humble, traits that echoed Neil's quiet personality. Today, Eric remains a keeper of his father's legacy, but on his own terms. He balances honoring Neil's place in history with the life he built for himself, one centered on family, work, and the values passed down from his parents. Mark Armstrong, the youngest son of Neil and Janet, was born in April 1963, just a year after the family had endured the devastating loss of their daughter Karen. For Neil and Janet, Mark's arrival was a moment of renewal. Janet once reflected, "Mark was our light after the darkest time. His laughter brought us back to life." Unlike Eric, who was old enough to remember the Apollo years clearly, Mark was only 6 years old when his father walked on the moon. He recalled watching the landing on television with neighbors and friends, saying later in interviews, "I saw it the way everyone else did, on a little black and white TV, except my dad was the one on the screen." He often joked, "My dad went to the moon, and I had to go back to first grade the next morning." Growing up, Mark inherited his father's curiosity and love for science, but expressed it differently. He pursued studies in engineering and later found his place in the technology sector, working in software and business development. A colleague once described him as thoughtful, analytical, and steady, very much his father's son, but with his own creative streak. That creative streak showed itself in his love for music. Mark became an accomplished guitarist and songwriter, often performing in smaller settings or at special events. In one interview, he admitted, "Music was always my way of balancing the technical with the emotional. My dad appreciated that, even if he didn't say much about it." Over the years, Mark became more publicly visible than his older brother Eric, often representing the Armstrong family at space-related events, anniversaries, and commemorations. He worked closely with museums and foundations to preserve his father's legacy. When consulted for the film First Man, 2018, he helped ensure that Neil was portrayed truthfully. "We wanted people to see him as he really was, not larger than life, but human," Mark said. Despite the public appearances, he valued his privacy as much as Neil did. Friends noted that he balanced public duty with personal independence. One family friend explained, "Mark never chased the limelight. He stepped forward when it mattered, to honor his father and what Apollo meant. But the rest of the time, he's just Mark." Like his father, he has supported causes tied to education, science, and inspiring young people. At a recent Apollo anniversary, he told students, "You don't have to be famous to change the world. You just need passion and persistence." Hobbies, family, and music continue to shape his life. While Neil Armstrong's shadow loomed large, Mark carved out an identity that blended technology, creativity, and a deep respect for legacy. In his own words, "Being Neil Armstrong's son is part of who I am, but not all of who I am. My dad wouldn't have wanted it any other way." Eric and Mark Armstrong grew up in a world unlike most children, yet they both managed to shape their own paths while carrying the weight of their father's historic legacy. Eric, the eldest, leaned into a life of privacy and family. His career reflected his technical abilities and his independence, but he avoided the spotlight. a choice that echoed Neil's own desire for a quiet life after Apollo. Those who knew Eric often pointed out his steady demeanor, his calmness, and his preference for living outside the gaze of history. At commemorations, he occasionally stepped forward, not to celebrate fame, but to remind people of the collective achievement of Apollo. "My dad never wanted to be seen as a hero," Eric once remarked. He wanted people to remember what was possible when thousands of people worked toward a single goal. Mark, on the other hand, found himself more comfortable in public roles, not for personal recognition, but as a caretaker of authenticity. He became a bridge between Neil's private world and the public's endless fascination. Whether working with museums, speaking at schools, or consulting on First Man, Mark ensured that his father's story was told truthfully. His involvement was not about myth-making, but about preserving the essence of Neil's humility. As he explained, "We wanted people to see Dad as he really was, not a superhero, not a distant figure, but a man, someone who worked hard, cared for his family, and did his job." Beyond their differences, Eric and Mark shared a devotion to honoring their father while also living their own lives. They built families, pursued careers, and embraced personal passions, from Eric's engineering pursuits to Mark's love of music. One family friend summarized it well: "Eric carries Neil's quiet side, and Mark carries his voice. Together they keep their father's legacy whole. Their paths may have diverged, but both sons embodied the lessons their father lived by: humility, perseverance, and integrity. And in doing so, they kept the memory of Neil Armstrong not only as the first man on the moon, but as the man who came home each night as Dad." Neil Armstrong's legacy extended far beyond his time on Earth, and his sons Eric and Mark have carried it with quiet dignity. When Neil passed away in August 2012, tributes poured in from around the world. He was remembered not only as the first man on the moon, but as a symbol of courage, humility, and exploration. President Barack Obama said, "Neil was among the greatest of American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time." Fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin called him a true American hero and the best pilot I ever knew. Armstrong was laid to rest at sea in a private ceremony conducted by the U.S. Navy on September 14, 2012. As a former naval aviator, it was a fitting farewell. The ceremony took place aboard the USS Philippine Sea in the Atlantic Ocean. Family, including Eric and Mark, watched as his ashes were committed to the sea. A bugler played taps, and sailors rendered honors, underscoring his lifelong connection to flight and service. The memorials in his honor were immense. NASA renamed several facilities for him, and countless schools, research centers, streets, and even celestial features, like the asteroid 6469 Armstrong and a lunar crater, bear his name. He received nearly every top award imaginable, from the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal to international honors from dozens of nations. To this day, statues of Armstrong stand in places like Purdue University and the U.S. Capitol, while exhibits at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserve his Apollo 11 spacesuit and artifacts. For his sons, the ceremonies were both public and deeply personal. Mark later said, "The world lost a hero, but we lost a father." What mattered most to him wasn't the fame, it was the work, the integrity, and the people around him. Eric echoed the same sentiment, telling a crowd at an anniversary event, "The best way to honor Dad is not to put him on a pedestal, but to live by the values he carried: humility, persistence, and respect for others." Today, Neil Armstrong is remembered not only in history books, but in the living legacy his children protect. Eric honors him through his quiet strength, his family life, and his engineering-minded career, while Mark honors him by sharing his story with the world, ensuring the legend never overshadows the man. As one family friend put it, "Together, the Armstrong boys carry both halves of their father, his silence and his voice." And so Neil Armstrong rests as he lived, with grace, humility, and enduring respect. His words from the moon still echo across generations, but his truest legacy lives on in the sons who remember him simply as Dad. Neil Armstrong's story has been told countless times: the pilot, the astronaut, the first man on the moon. But for Eric and Mark, he was also the quiet father who came home at the end of the day, who carried both triumph and tragedy with humility. When Neil passed away in 2012, the world honored him with memorials, awards, and monuments. But his sons honored him by living out the values he cherished: perseverance, integrity, and a devotion to family. Today, Eric and Mark keep his memory alive in different ways, reminding us that behind every legend is a man, and behind every man is a family. And maybe that's the real lesson. Greatness isn't just in the moment when history is made, but in the lives that carry it forward.
So what do you think? Should Neil Armstrong be remembered more for his giant leap or for the quiet life he lived afterward? Let us know in the comments below.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the hidden stories behind history's most famous names. Because sometimes the most fascinating part of history is what comes after.